Mr. Ambassador, very good to see you.
Good to see you, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you too. We've spoken in April of last year, and you warned Azerbaijan of trying to steer clear of a possible conflict with between Iran and the United States. And of course, in the last few days, this conflict has come to pass. What do you see the developments in the region as? Was it more of a decisiveness on part of the United States and President Trump, or was it impulsiveness?
Yeah, I think that's a question that you see debated here in Washington today. I certainly in April didn't foresee the situation that we face today, which is neither to the advantage of Iran nor of the United States. But that having been said, I think there was a combination of decisiveness, if you want to think about forward planning from months or maybe even a year ago, where the administration was trying to dismantle the JCPOA, the Obama-era agreement on nuclear with Iran, and the sanctions that were applied and the other steps that have been taken since then would, in retrospect, look like they were planned or at least anticipated. On the other hand, there was a impulsiveness about the action that was taken to begin this most recent round of exchanges, military exchanges with Iran, including the assassination of Soleimani. And so what we're seeing today is a situation that's emerged out of a complex both of deliberation and of emotional decision-making.
You referenced JCPOA, the comprehensive nuclear deal with Iran, but the United States is not the only signatory to the deal. My question is whether Iran withdrawing from JCPOA, as it threatens to do so at the time, would strain its relations with Russia and the European Union as well.
Yeah, I think in this case it's a question of listening to the rhetoric that the regime in Tehran is using now, threatening, if not at some point in the future, very short term, to withdraw from any limitations on its ability to develop a nuclear weapon. And what I believe is probably a very conscious thinking about the next steps that would make sense for Iran to take, recognizing that they're going to need support of the international community in dealing with the United States. So I think Tehran will not take a step that would antagonize either Russia or the Europeans on the nuclear question, but hold the ambiguity out there in a public sense, because it does strengthen their position of standing up to the United States for domestic purposes.
Mm-hmm. As recently as roughly a month ago, there were really serious public protests, a wave of protests in Iran. People were protesting dire economic situation and conditions. Now that the United States, as perceived by the street in Tehran, in Iran, attacked Iran, some argued that there would be this rally around the flag effect among the Iranian public, even those who do not particularly like the current regime in Iran. I will ask this question as, looking from Azerbaijan, because we see an unexpected wave of support for the Iranian government among some people in Azerbaijan. Most observers definitely were not expecting this kind of level of support. Do you think the antagonism between the United States and Iran plays to the hands of the regime in Tehran, one way or the other?
Well, I think it does, and I say this not as an expert on Iranian developments, but having spent 3 years in Azerbaijan and watching Iran's behavior, both with respect to developments in Azerbaijan, but in the South Caucasus as a whole, there is a tendency for Iranians, both Farsi and non-Farsi, to rally around the government when it appears that Iran is being treated poorly, or, as in this case, having been attacked. Again, my judgment is that it's not unexpected for this kind of public reaction to take place, even though, as you point out, just a few weeks ago, maybe even days ago, there were these massive demonstrations in the streets against the regime. But those demonstrations were based on economic and domestic political reasons more than international. So I think that, at least from my point of view, this is a predictable reaction. Now, what happens in Azerbaijan, I think, is another story. You know better than I that you have Shia-Sunni differences. You have people who are closer to Iran, both Azerbaijanis and non-Azerbaijanis. Mm-hmm. So I think it's understandable that there would be a mixture of caution, which I think the government has been very cautious in terms of responding to these latest developments, and support for Iran from people who one would normally expect to be supportive of their neighbor.
You referenced your time in Azerbaijan. Right. I am curious, what would be the implications of a nuclear-armed Iran for its neighbors in the region? How much would it change the power balance, or even the perception of Iran, or even the heft of Iran when it comes to Azerbaijan and smaller nations around it? Should people fear?
Well, I think all of us should fear the spread of nuclear weapons, whether it's Iran, North Korea, fill in the blank. I think that should be just a basic human concern. I'm not so sure the fact that Iran, if it were to achieve that breakthrough and produce a nuclear weapon, would have any greater influence in the region than it already has. It already is very influential. It is a country of consequence because of its size, because of the economic and energy relations that it has with Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. So I think a nuclear weapon in and of itself, because I doubt that the Iranians would threaten Baku with being attacked with nuclear weapons, I don't think that's going to make that much of a difference. On the other hand, I think countries like Russia, like Turkey, like some European countries should be concerned about the development of the nuclear weapons in Iran, and the capacity that they already have demonstrated to use strategic missiles, and strategic in a small s, not intercontinental, but strategic missiles to attack targets, as they did with the oil installations in Saudi Arabia, and then the other day on the bases, U.S. bases in Iraq.
Well, following the attacks on the U.S. bases in Iraq, President Trump tried to spin, if I read his statement correctly, tried to spin the follow-up as sort of a victory for the United States by saying that no American lives were lost. But when we look at history, we can hardly find any other example when a U.S. military installation abroad was attacked by a nation state, and the attack, when not only did it go unanswered, but the President of the United States tried to portray it as a victory of some sorts, moral or military or what have you. Right. Do you think it was a victory? Do you think it's a dangerous precedent? Does it surprise you that the United States did not go farther?
Well, I think in a kind of an abstract sense, yes, I was surprised that there wasn't a reaction for precisely the reasons that you point out. I mean, I can think back to this attack on a discotheque in West Berlin, where several American soldiers were killed. This was back in I want to say the early 80s, involved Libya, and President Reagan launched air attacks against Libya in response to that very specific event. However, I think this is quite different. And I think that there is a recognition that neither Iran nor the United States are going to come out, if you want to think in terms of winners or losers, are going to come out as winners if we engage in a tit-for-tat exchange for every event that has taken place since the assassination of Soleimani. So I don't see the United States as winning. On the one hand, I'm not surprised that the president has taken the position he has taken, but I think it's a mistake for any of us to believe that this is a story that has had the last chapter written in it. There's still more to come.
Of course, we're commenting on the story that is developing, and every hour there are new developments. Yes. But based on what we know right now, is it safe to say, am I correct to presume that the president receives all kinds of advice from various points, might be the Pentagon, might be the State Department, so diplomatic and military sources, and we may presume that in this case the military has the ear of the U.S. president, so his actions in a way are influenced by what the Pentagon thinks is prudent at this time. So can we say that the Pentagon does not want a full-out war with Iran? Will it make people in the region think that America is afraid of Iran or afraid of engaging Iran?
Well, I guess I'm the wrong person to ask about what people in the region think. But we have a tradition in the United States, and it's not really recognized, I think, fully outside. The people who least want to go to war are people in the military, and it's because they know what happens. They know what happens when you go to war. Young people, now men and women, die. And no one in a uniform in the United States wants to see that happen, if it can be avoided. So certainly in my diplomatic experience, it's really been a case where the military have been the least anxious of all of the elements within the U.S. government to get involved in what we would regard as military-to-military combat, a war. I think, well, it's hard to say who President Trump is listening to right now on this particular set of issues. It would appear that the deliberative part of this may have been coming from Secretary of State Pompeo, who and when National Security Advisor Bolton was present, they were more, how shall I put it, more aggressive in terms of what U.S. policy should be toward Iran. But I think, given what happened, that the U.S. military is going to have a lot to say about what the future steps are. So, as President Trump often says, we will see. But I think the inclination right now, absent some catastrophic event that I can't predict, is to look for ways other than military action. So that's where I think diplomacy comes back. That after the one thing that this exchange has given the opportunity for is diplomatic engagement, direct, indirect, public, not so public, between Iran and the United States. I'm not sure whether there's a basis for negotiations, but we'll see.
I would like to ask you about the emergent Russia. To put it in a context, Russia is coming back on the global diplomatic stage. It is certainly attempting to play a more significant role in the Middle East. Some Russian observers and international observers that I've read recently say that Russia is uniquely positioned to play an international intermediary because it has a clout to call a multilateral diplomatic effort, a conference, a peace conference, if you will. But Russia, is it perceived as a fair and balanced intermediary? Because Iranians probably trust Russia more than the Americans do. Am I correct to presume that?
Well, I think they probably do because of the history of certainly in this last several decades of very close relations between Russia and Iran. That Russia and Iran, have seen it in their short-term interest to cooperate to try to reduce U.S. influence, particularly in the South Caucasus. From any perspective, given the situation we have today, Russia is one country who could speak to both President Trump and the leadership in Tehran and be listened to. While I'm very critical of Russian behavior around the world, starting in the South Caucasus, but going to Syria and obviously Ukraine, on the other hand, they can be, if they chose, a party to bring the U.S. and Iranians together to work on a diplomatic solution. Whether they will or not, I really don't know. I don't know what's going through Putin's mind right now. But I think the situation is such that if they chose to act in that way as a mediator, they could play a role.
We Azerbaijanis tend to bring every global situation, every international development to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And I guess you cannot blame us because we're the losing party in the war. Right. My question is, given the latest escalation in the region, will the United States diplomatic circles or the White House or the military be looking at Iran's quote-unquote allies in the region? In other words, I'm bringing this to Armenia. Will Iranian-Armenian relations be examined in Washington? Will there be anything coming out of this?
Right.
And also Iranian-Russian relations, which are also, Armenian-Russian relations, which are also very close. Will that sort of get on the radar now?
Well, Washington has had a historic problem of focusing on developments in the South Caucasus to the degree that some of us would like. And I think the real risk now is twofold. One, even without the conflict between Iran and the U.S. being at the level that it is, the Minsk Group process, the diplomatic engagement between Armenia and Azerbaijan has not progressed over the last year. The military confrontation has continued, both sides acquiring weapons, Azerbaijan acquiring more, so that with the lack of a diplomatic process, the risk of conflict, military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan increases. And with the United States distracted, potentially Russia distracted as well, I think the risk of an accidental resumption of military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is higher now. Where I expect the United States to pay some attention to the South Caucasus will be any additional sanctions that we chose or choose to levy on Iran. The President in his speech mentioned that there were going to be stronger sanctions. This could affect Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia because of the economic and particularly energy relations that exist between Iran and Armenia, and to a certain extent, Iran and Azerbaijan, Nakhchivan being the key element there. So if there is an effort to strengthen sanctions, there may be Washington pressure on Yerevan and Baku to end those energy ties with Iran. I think that would be a mistake. I would hope that there would be some idea of having a relaxation of some of those sanctions for countries that have no choice in some of their energy relations. But I think that's really where Washington will start to bear down on both countries. Less about Nagorno-Karabakh, more about economic sanctions. I think that the Azerbaijani relationship with both the United States and with Israel and its relationship with Iran becomes a complicating factor. Azerbaijan has tried to walk a very careful line, not offending anyone in that tripartite relationship, but that's going to be harder, especially if the tensions rise between the U.S. and and Iran. Where Russia fits into this, not entirely clear. They are probably in a position to provide more protection to both Baku and Yerevan in the event of a military conflict between the U.S. and Iran. So to a certain extent, they occupy they have a stronger hand to play, both because they provide military equipment to both sides, but also because they're in a position to make sure that Iran does nothing that would harm either Armenia or Azerbaijan, again, should they choose to do that.
So if I'm hearing you right, Russia does stand to benefit from a conflict between Iran and the United States if this conflict is escalated, because it'll be playing a more active role in the region.
I think that would be my judgment as well. But, again, that requires, a sort of leap in knowledge that I don't think anybody has right now as to what the next steps are. But if you end up in a worst-case situation, I think Russia does come out ahead.
You referenced the OSCE process and the Minsk group in general. If we look at the latest foreign ministerial meeting of OSCE in Bratislava, Mike Pompeo snubbed it for the second time in a row. And this sort of did not go unnoticed. And American diplomats present at the meeting exchanged some very sharp rhetoric with Russia, which, caused some stir in Russia, because Russia is not always directly accused of involvement in conflicts and violating OSCE rules and principles by foreign diplomats, let alone American diplomats, so directly, in such a direct manner. What do you think of the future of the OSCE process? Is it, does the current intransigence between America, the United States and Russia, does it translate or does it reverberate throughout the processes that OSCE is trying to control or, bring order to?
Well, I've been involved either from the Washington end or from Baku or both on the process of finding some solution, if that's possible, to the conflict regarding Nagorno-Karabakh from the earliest days in the 90s, from before when the OSCE was directly involved. And I think we learned some lessons in those early days. I hope Russia learned the same, that unilaterally, no matter how powerful we think or we actually are in the region, in a conflict like this, a single outside power cannot bring about a solution. So we failed in our unilateral effort. Russia did not succeed in its unilateral effort. Even the Iranians tried unilaterally, and they weren't successful. So at the time, and we're talking early 1990s, the OSCE was the only mechanism where Russia was a member, US and European countries were a member, Armenia, Azerbaijan were members. So fast forward to 2020, if it's not the OSCE, then what is it? You still need a multilateral framework because none of these countries today who are involved in the Minsk group can bring about a solution. You need a structure where Armenia and Azerbaijan are already members so that we don't have to invent a new platform for this. So despite its lack of success, I think the OSCE remains the only multilateral framework on which to base a mediated settlement to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. But I think and I've said this before, and people don't like to hear it, that the burden of proof in achieving a diplomatic breakthrough really rests on the shoulders of the leaders in both Yerevan and Baku to begin a serious bilateral diplomatic process to settle the conflict. The OSCE can mediate, and mediate it means you help the parties to the conflict resolve it. You don't provide the solution yourself.
Do you think there's a political will to initiate a serious process right now in Baku or Yerevan?
Well, right now with the parliamentary elections in Azerbaijan, I would say no. No one, either opposition or government, is going to to take a stand for a diplomatic solution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict before the February elections. That's just not going to happen. And I'm not sure things are that much better in Yerevan either. I really think the NK issue remains a stumbling block for President Papazyan. He's taken some pretty strong rhetorical positions that would be hard for him to back away from, but are hardly the basis for a negotiated settlement to the conflict. So I think right now, in the short run, that is between now and early summer, I don't see the incentive for the parties to come to a new stage in their bilateral engagement. But ultimately, it's going to have to be bilateral. It's going to be the leaders of the two countries sitting down and saying, what can we do to end this? And that would be a tough negotiation to be in.
Well, for either side, either party to make concessions, it has to have unquestionable legitimacy in the eyes of the people for the agreement to hold in the long-term perspective. Because if the government changes, the following government may say, oh, these people were illegitimate. Yes. They had no right to negotiate a concession on behalf of the people. Do you think Ilham Aliyev and his current government do have this type of legitimacy that would hold throughout the years?
You know, holding throughout the years is a rather open-ended situation. What I worry about in Azerbaijan in particular, and just thinking of as I understand the current domestic political alignments in the country, both the government and the opposition, however you want to define the opposition, have no political benefit coming from asserting that the only way to settle the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is through diplomatic negotiation, which by definition involves compromises on both sides. I just don't see politically how any of the forces in Azerbaijan today can do that. This is not my idea. Certainly others have talked about it for a long time. But until both Yerevan and Baku bring along the publics of Armenia and Azerbaijan to understand that a diplomatic process that involves compromise is not to the disadvantage of either of the parties, it's going to be very hard for whatever leadership to make an agreement stick absent the support of the public. And unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, political leaders have benefited from a hard position on settling the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. That, by hard, I mean it's going to be either or. You know, there's no room for compromise, and that's on both sides. So, we're in a situation today where, in the short run, I just don't see there being the breakthrough. Maybe after the parliamentary elections in Azerbaijan, the government may feel it can begin to work seriously on negotiating a settlement. But certainly the rhetoric today is not in that direction.
You know, I will say, and feel free to disagree with me because you're at least as astute an observer of Azerbaijani developments as I am. I would say that there are not very many points on which the opposition, the government of Ilham Aliyev, and even the majority of the public in Azerbaijan agree, barred Nagorno-Karabakh. Right. That is an issue where the positions are almost identical. There are some nuances, but you know, for the intents and purposes of this conversation, they're more or less identical. Now, I'm trying to, what I see the situation as is, it would be a political suicide for any power or any opposition group or even the government to come out and say that, yes, we will make some painful compromises in attempting to resolve the situation. So given the fact that opposition and the government see almost eye to eye on the issue, how does it look? Do you think the parliamentary elections would solve anything? Do you think bringing in opposition into the parliament? In general, let me ask you this. Do you think that the government is trying to bring opposition forces into the government to show Armenians, look, it is not only us who don't want to make compromises, but even the opposition doesn't. What do you think of this whole process?
Well, I mean, the elections have always been a stumbling point in the Minsk Group process and the negotiating process, whether it's a presidential election in Armenia or a parliamentary election in Azerbaijan. Both parties would say, well, we can't do anything now until after the elections. Mm-hmm. So I think to the extent that an election becomes kind of a barrier on the road that has to be lifted, yes, there's a potential after that for some progress. Now, what bringing in the opposition to the parliament would really mean in Azerbaijan, I think, is an interesting question. I mean, it certainly would be a first step in signaling, at least domestically, that the current regime sees it's important to make political changes, even if they're slight, to begin a process that could potentially lead to a negotiated end to the NK conflict. But I think there are really two things that have to be done first. One, especially in Baku, but both Baku and Yerevan have to permit people-to-people contacts and permit them in ways that they become natural, so that Armenians and Azerbaijanis can once again begin to know each other as human beings. And I was somewhat encouraged earlier this year, end of last year, I keep forgetting what year I'm in, when some Armenian journalists came to Azerbaijan and some Azerbaijani journalists went to Armenia. I think that's a good thing. But up to this point, certainly the government in Baku has been very reluctant to allow any kind of regular person-to-person contacts between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Second point, the Minsk Group has developed over the years this step-by-step approach with a series of measures that both Armenians and Azerbaijanis at one point or another have at least accepted the willingness to pursue of staged withdrawal of Armenian forces from occupied parts of Azerbaijan, and addressing some of the issues that relate to property in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as in what are now the occupied parts of Azerbaijan. I know from Azerbaijan's point of view, Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just saying that the staged approach, which narrows the political focus ultimately to the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh, takes place after a series of measures that ideally would build confidence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis to address that ultimate question. But even that, I think, is a difficult step to take. It's not that the steps are unknown. The steps are known. It's a question whether politically both sides are prepared to start that process.
Not often am I in a position to defend the Azerbaijani government. Actually, I can't remember another such occurrence. But to be fair, in this particular case, I do not believe that the government of Azerbaijan is imposing this limitation or restriction on public contacts between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. I believe in this particular case, it is reacting to what the people want. Right. We have a large population that is traumatized by the conflict. We have refugees who were thrown out of Armenia and from Azerbaijan itself, for whom it is a traumatizing sight probably to see Armenians walking around in Baku.
Right.
And there are legitimate concerns for their safety and security. So given the fact, I just don't have enough knowledge, historic knowledge to... I do know that such conflicts existed in the past between France and Germany, between Israelis and Palestinians. Some were resolved, some were not. What is there to do to change the situation for the better?
Well, after I left my my assignment in Azerbaijan, I went to Bosnia and Herzegovina as U.S. ambassador. I will admit that after my 2 years there, I was not particularly successful in building the basis for reconciliation among parties to what had been a traumatizing event in the history of Croats, Serbs, and Bosnian Muslims. But I came away from that with the conviction that the longer you maintain the separation between the peoples who have the most at stake in settling a conflict, whether it's a Balkan conflict or this one in the Caucasus, the more difficult it becomes, because the only way that, and especially young people, the only way that they see this conflict is through the perspective of the war. There's no normal pattern of interaction. We saw in Bosnia and Herzegovina that as long as the political forces were such to prevent direct contact, the likelihood of settling that bitter dispute was going to be hard. Excuse me. And I think the same goes in the Caucasus as well. It's not magic, but I think some of the steps that have been taken to prevent these contacts are really unnecessary.
Let me ask you about the parliamentary elections in Azerbaijan and what they look like to an observer, to an outside observer like yourself. To put it in a context, some observers who are located in the country, they say that since there was a change in the regime in Armenia, and it is now arguably more democratic than it used to be, there is a need in Baku to also sort of keep up and bring some semblance of pluralism into the government in terms of the opposition representation in the parliament. Do you see a correlation between what was happening in Armenia and the parliamentary elections in Azerbaijan?
I never thought that whatever was going on in Azerbaijan was taking its inspiration from developments in Armenia. I think that's the last place that anyone would cite, whether you were in the opposition or in the government side of things in Baku as being driving the process that you have underway. I think, and again, this is as an outside observer, I think what was going on in Azerbaijan was in part a natural transition from one generation to another. I used to somewhat jokingly say I've been gone for 20 years from Azerbaijan, but it's the same people who were sitting in the chairs when I was ambassador who are sitting in the chairs now. That's changing. What I don't know is whether the people who are brought in, again, from a optical point of view, very impressive, younger people in some cases with education in the US or the West, in Europe, always good things. But what I don't know is the answer to your question. Is this an effort simply to put a new face on the current regime and maintain the ultimate power relationships that everybody knows are in place? Or is it a sign of potential change and reform? Honestly, I don't see the reforms taking place. The municipal elections were not encouraging for me anyway. And we'll have to see whether with all the candidates that are being shown to exist for the parliamentary elections? Will they have an opportunity to have access to the media, to have rallies, to develop support as you would expect in a normal political process? And will the elections be different? I don't have a whole lot of confidence in that. On economic reform, the government has been talking about economic reforms for far too long. And unless something really happens, in other words, you get a private sector that's making investments in developing non-energy related business activities, entrepreneurs that don't have to worry about the tax authorities coming in and demanding to look at their books, demanding bribes. And for me, most importantly, is reforming the banking system, which still is in crisis after the International Bank of Azerbaijan essentially went belly up, and the banking system has not recovered from that. So I would like to be optimistic. I know people who I respect very much have pointed to the possibility of there being change and reform. I hope they're right, and I hope I'm wrong. But I just need to see a little more evidence that these parliamentary elections will be different, and that there will be significant reform in the way the economy functions, in the way freedom of expression is dealt with, in the way human rights are observed generally.
Staying on the issue of parliamentary elections, if we may, there seems to be some difference of opinion among the people we speak to, the people that leave comments, in terms of the role of the international observers in the elections. Some say the elections are illegitimate because certain organizations or groups of nations do not send international observers to the elections in Azerbaijan. Do you see the correlation between the presence or absence of international observers and the legitimacy of the process of the elections itself?
Well, it really depends on the election. I mean, whether it's international observers, domestic observers, if you continue to have, as we did in the municipal elections, and we've been seeing this. I go back to my first electoral observation in 1995 in Azerbaijan, and it was the same thing that we saw on social media after the municipal elections. Large numbers of ballots being deposited by a single individual. These carousel kinds of voting patterns where people would be bused to visit, bused to vote in different districts. The only difference between 1995 and just the end of last year is social media. We didn't have the internet, cell phone cameras and the like to record that, but we could observe the counting that was going on in regional centers and see with our own eyes as international observers that this electoral process was being manipulated. So it's not the presence or absence of international observers as much as it is, has the electoral process itself changed? And that I'm not sure. I think when you go out to the regions, there has not been enough change in leadership in the regions to convince me that these elections will not be as preordained as previous elections were. The local authorities will see to that. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I would like to see some real electoral contests out there where people's votes count in a literal sense, and that the elections themselves are conducted in as free and as fair a process as possible.
In our previous interview, you talked about some rhetoric you hear from the region that alarms you, and you mentioned Israel. It is quite obvious that good relations between Azerbaijan and Israel are a major irritant for Iran. Would you be able to comment, is it in Azerbaijan's interests, from where you stand, to forge good relations with Israel, even though it might complicate Azerbaijani-Iranian relations? Is there something for Azerbaijan to gain in terms of the good relations with Israel?
Well, I think any relationship with Israel for Azerbaijan, and let's sort of remove ourselves from the current conflict, is a good thing. And I think there are very good reasons for Azerbaijan and Israel to have close relations. Azerbaijan has a small but vibrant Jewish population that has enjoyed freedom of religion and everything that goes with it now for a long time. Certainly ever since the beginning of the latest independence of Azerbaijan. So I think there are good reasons and things that really would justify close ties between Azerbaijan and Israel. Where the problem arises is in a crisis like we are today, where obviously Iran and Israel are almost as much antagonists as the US and Iran are. Now Azerbaijan is put in a difficult position, whereas before it was possible to more easily navigate between Tehran, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Washington. It's become much more difficult. You mentioned a point earlier about pressure that Washington would bring to bear on Baku. There may be pressures that Israel brings to bear on Baku, and we know that Iran brings pressures to bear. And what I worried about in April was if we do have, a more conflictual relationship between the U.S. And Iran, that Azerbaijan is going to be caught in a difficult position. I'm not saying it would have to choose one over the other, but that anything that Azerbaijan does that appears to be favorable to Washington or Israel, or both, will be seen in Tehran as a unfriendly act. And we all know the Iranians are quite capable of doing things that can punish Azerbaijan short of an invasion. So my concern is the good that came, and I still think continues to come from a good relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan, now is in a much more difficult situation because of the conflict with the U.S. and Iran. Quite honestly, I think the best position for the Azerbaijan government to take seems to be the one that they are taking now, which is to be very calm and quiet in this conflict situation, recognizing that Iran is nearby and a country that is perhaps most involved in how Azerbaijan acts with respect to the U.S. and with Israel as well. Well, I mean, Iran is a big neighbor. That's look at the map. Even though most Americans can't find Iran, on the other hand, I think that just geographically, Iran has much more influence. On the other hand, the fact that there are Azerbaijanis living in, however you want to describe it, South Azerbaijan or North Iran, does in fact give Azerbaijan some influence in Iran. The Iranians have to be aware of that relationship as well, though I must confess I do not understand the strength of the ties between Azerbaijanis living in Iran and Azerbaijanis in the Republic of Iran today. Republic
of Azerbaijan, you meant, right?
Yes, Republic of Azerbaijan, yeah. Right. I think that's the formal name, yeah. Right. But that said, I think the Iranian influence in Baku is something that I think Azerbaijan has to be concerned about.
I would like you to comment on the recent rhetoric that we heard from Ilham Aliyev in terms of the relations with Europe. Some people say that this was for domestic consumption. Some people say that this was a warning shot to Europe in terms of, sweeten the deal or we're going to walk away. What do you make of Ilham Aliyev's statements that not all European values are good for Azerbaijan and there might be some reversal in the direction? What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not sure Azerbaijan has made up its mind, quite frankly. And whether you're talking about the people of Azerbaijan or the leadership, that's another story. On the one hand, we just had the ceremony with Tanap pipeline being inaugurated again, but the message there from the Azerbaijani side, from President Aliyev, was that we have solidified our energy relationship with Europe, and this is going to be very important going forward. On the other side, as you've also pointed out in the speech that President Aliyev made, I think in December, it was very clear that he had drawn a very thick red line about how much further Azerbaijan was prepared to go in its relationship with Europe. Does not want to become a member of the EU. There was some reference to anti-Muslim attitudes in Europe, and you've got this complicated relationship where economically selling gas in particular to Europe is very much in Azerbaijan's interest, and therefore good relations are necessary for that. But on the other hand, not wanting Europe to have too much involvement in domestic processes in Azerbaijan. By that I mean human rights, democratic building, freedom of expression, which would come along with a closer relationship to Europe. I don't think Azerbaijan has sorted that out entirely. I argued now almost 5 years ago that by virtue of a polemic that Ramiz Mekdiev had issued, that he was signaling that Russia was going to be the privileged partner for Azerbaijan in the future, mainly because the West had not supported Azerbaijan properly and was undermining the domestic system there. I think that is still the tendency, to be more favorable to a stronger relationship with Russia. For one thing, Russia doesn't ask hard questions about human rights issues. But on the other hand, Russia does provide some support for Azerbaijan in terms of military sales. That's important in this conflict with Armenia. So where are we right now? I don't know. In some respects, it's like what we were talking about with Iran and the nuclear program. The rhetoric is very hardline. Behind the scenes, there may be a more thoughtful process going on that would maybe tell a different story, but it's just really hard to say today where this relationship with Europe is going to be going. But I think the energy part is still going to be an important part of that, and will be hard for Azerbaijan to turn away from.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time, and I hope we get to talk to you soon.
Well, nice talking to you, and I wish everyone in Azerbaijan a successful, peaceful, and prosperous 2020.